There's so much going on lately. Fable, the newest model from Anthropic, has been re-released, and now the GPT 5.6 generation of models is public. The government has allowed that. And as always, there's a new debate going on. Last year, we were wondering if we should even be handwriting any code, and now we're wondering if we should even be reading any of the code at all, now that we have this next generation of models. Now, I'm actually going to look at that question very seriously. Of course, I have my biases. Everybody does. I think most serious people at this point would say that the idea of not reading any of your code is just a ridiculous thing to do. And I would certainly agree with that, even now, even with models like Fable and GPT 5.6. But that doesn't mean there isn't an interesting discussion to be had. And so a few things I want to mention, first of all, is that most people are already not reading most of their code. Unless you're like Jonathan Blow and you're even implementing your own game engine to create your own game, there's a lot of layers that you are not responsible for. Obviously, there are things like operating systems and database engines, which are generally pretty reliable. Then there are language runtimes, which are also usually pretty reliable, but not always. If you took a look at the Bun Rewrite blog, you'll see that they had plenty of issues. For the more relevant parts, things like libraries and frameworks and things like component libraries for front-end frameworks, this generally makes up a lot of the code that's actually being shipped, but we're only responsible for a pretty small amount of it. That's one point that's made, but also keep in mind that just because you're not responsible for this doesn't mean another person isn't. There is a distinction between not reading AI-generated code versus not reading code that another human has written. Also, keep in mind that people, generally developers, are the ones still responsible for choosing these things, choosing which framework to use, which library to use. And so there is a level of trust established if you're using a framework like React. You know, there's a lot of people that are responsible for making sure those things are high quality. And there's a lot to lose if those things have a lot of issues. Another thing I want to look at is this very oversimplified diagram, because I think this is actually where a lot of disagreement comes from. This is where a lot of actually the hype is built. And I know I've criticized the hype machine a lot, but I don't think it's always people being nefarious and trying to manipulate other people. I think it's just that people are approaching things completely differently. Now, before I get started on that long-winded rant, I think now is a good time to take a short break. There's a lot of debate lately on the future of software development. I don't have all the answers, but one thing I am confident in is that most agentic development is going to move away from agents running on your machine to agents running in the cloud. That's why I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Cursor, who's early on this. Well, first of all, I'm already experiencing one of the benefits as I'm recording this because I record on a Windows machine. I generally develop on my MacBook, but everything is synced because I'm actually in my browser right now. All of these sessions that I have are automatically going to be synced to any device that I'm using, including even my phone, actually, because now they do have an iOS app. And a concrete example, a couple weeks ago in one of my videos, I talked about having a bug fixing recurring event. I think that's one of the best use cases of agents. I get a lot of bug reports. Normally, I tediously would copy paste it into a prompt, have the agent fix it. If I try to schedule it on my machine, I have to worry about my machine actually being on and not asleep to make sure that automation actually runs. Well, with cloud agents, you obviously don't have to worry about that. It makes so much sense. Why isn't everybody doing it? Well, one of the reasons is environment setup. You already have everything set up on your machine, including like permissions and stuff. You probably don't want to have to manually set things up every single time you spawn a new cloud agent. Well, Cursor actually spent a lot of time making sure that was as painless as possible. And as evidence, I clicked just a single button and Cursor figured out everything about how to set up and run my app. And as proof, it automatically recorded a video that I can watch as proof that it actually did run my app and it works as expected. I'm really excited about this. You can try it out at neetcode.fyi/cursor. So like I said, this is an oversimplified diagram. It's also highly company dependent, but my idea of a junior dev, like the core responsibility is to generally implement things. And usually that's code. Now, there's a lot of other responsibilities of a junior dev as well. You're learning about the product, you're involved in meetings, but the core responsibility is implement code that you may not even be designing. Now, for each of these roles here, it's not always a one-to-one. Pretty much everywhere, I think, there's like a level of you're working one level up and working one level down. Like there's a lot of overlap between, like for mid-level, there's some overlap for above and below. Once you go one level higher, you're also designing your own code. At least that's like a core responsibility. That can involve API design or some level of architecture design. The design part is really always been the most important part of software development. That's why the actual implementation could be delegated to somebody else. If it's just about implementing some functions, not that that's not important, not that that couldn't be done wrong, especially depending on the type of work you're doing. This is extremely important, but the design just encompasses more than that. And the actual implementation is dependent on the design. And one level above that, you get to senior or tech lead, which I'm kind of merging together. And I'm also ignoring that there are higher levels than this, like principal engineers. The core responsibility is to design and delegate. Now, obviously, it's company and role dependent. There are plenty of seniors that don't end up delegating. They just design and implement their own big features. There's no way I could create this diagram that would be accurate for every company and every person. So let's just try to keep it simple. But these designs are generally bigger and affect the entire team. So you might be even choosing which frameworks to use, which databases to use, and then breaking up that work and then delegating that work. And then there's managers and directors where things get kind of blurry. But at this level, generally, you don't write code, and most of the time you don't read code either. That's kind of the point of this section. And depending on company size, you might not even have this, you might just have that. But the idea is that this is sort of a spectrum, right? I want to talk about one of those disagreements. For example, we've had a lot of people, even before the models got really, really good, which was, in my opinion, November of last year, we had people saying before, and people are saying now with Fable as well, that, okay, I just give it a relatively vague prompt, something like, okay, build X. And that could be anything, maybe a calculator, maybe a web app that works end to end. And what they get out is something that actually works. Even some kind of video game, it does actually work. And so that's when they say, holy crap, all of this stuff, everything below it is no longer necessary. Now, at the same time, on some level, this was kind of always possible in terms of you could just go to somebody's GitHub repo, clone something as close as possible to it, and